Welcome everybody to the motions breakdown of the fall season. Um, Ari and I are here to answer all of your questions regarding the motions that you might have, and also give you some background information, some strategies on how to handle them. Um, I'm gonna cover one motion from west and one from east, and Ari is gonna do the same. You're gonna have a lot of opportunities to ask questions throughout that, with specific dedicated slides, at least on my part, but also if you have a question that comes up during the other slides, just unmute yourself, raise your hand, and ask, type it in the comments, however you feel free. I think this seminar is going to be very useful to you. The more questions you ask, the better. So with that said, let's get into it. Starting with the motion, this house would ban the broadcast of recordings produced by terrorists. First of all, as we also talked in the first speeches seminar, we kind of have to distinguish what the issue is that the motion is trying to present, to identify that issue, and to do that, we kind of have to focus on some of the important terms that we can see in the motion. First, I want to move your attention to the produced by. Produced by means that when you're debating this motion as prop or op, as prop you want to ban specifically the recordings that are produced by terrorists. This would not include media and news outlets that are just covering an event of a terrorist attack, for example, but it would include terrorist organizations or terrorist leaders or just members of a terrorist organization who are in some ways recording their actions and in some way sending them somewhere or posting them on a media or similar stuff. Also, another huge point of this debate is going to be actually how to define terrorists. We obviously have some organizations such as NATO and UN who have official definitions of what a terrorist might be, but when you're talking about media, and especially not social media but news and stuff, they will be controlled on a national level. So it's always important to kind of consider how different governments will define different organizations as terrorists, and if that can kind of get a bit messy. So take that into consideration. The would ban part of the motion assumes that you're going to need a model. I'm going to go over how to present the model in this motion a bit later. But basically you need to tell us as the proposition how this ban is going to work and how it's going to be the most effective, where the opposition does not need to provide a counter model. They could if they want to, but their main job should be disproving a potential model from the other side and saying why it just would not work or would not be effective. And finally, with broadcast, I want to move your attention to where would that be broadcast. As I said, it could be like on a news channel, on TV, it can be on social media. You kind of have to think on what's most impactful, what can be on prop, be more useful to be banned, whether in both places, and how would that work. And an opposition maybe providing us with reasons why stopping the broadcast would or would not work. So yeah. Moving on to some of the key actors and important things to consider. In order to find out the key actors, we kind of have to think of who is important to this debate. For example, that being the general public. I think when we are debating terrorist organizations and banning recordings which would be seen by the mass media, it's very by the mass population of people. It's most important to kind of gather our attention on the safety of the people, whether those bans would lead to a safer society, whether they would make it dangerous when you're in side opposition. You can also consider the mental health of the individual. Not seeing those recordings might lead people to um, have some mental issues, just overall be stressed in seeing all those events on the news. But on the other hand, you also have to consider the right to be informed. As a regular individual of society. Also, you have to think about the government. The government is probably going to be the main actor in your debate in terms of who is enforcing the ban. You can also do it in some other way as an organization that is assigned specifically to do it. And you can also include and talk about NATO and UN, as I think they would be the more practical to kind of regulate this ban on an international level. And also in edge cases where a government might decide that they view a certain organization as terroristic, where not only the organization itself does not, but also other governments. And an organization that works on an international level might be there to regulate this. And finally, also you have to kind of look and consider the media outlets, like the right and the benefits of having an independent media in your country does not being regulated by the government versus the actual need of censorship in those cases, such as recordings produced by terrorists. Here are some questions that you need to ask yourself in order to be able to make a successful model. First of all, you gotta ask yourself, how is this ban going to monitor the media to make sure that those recordings are not being shown? As I said, you can do that on TV level, on news channels. You can do it also on like social media. You also, as I said, have to kind of focus on how those individual governments are going to define what a terrorist organization is, who are the terrorists, so they will be able to ban content that's produced by them, and to ensure that only content that's produced by what they see as terrorist is being banned and not something else from organizations that might not deserve the ban. Yeah, and also you have to think about what would be the consequences of not following the ban, or maybe the government being too strict with such a ban. Would there be fines? Would there be sanctions? How would they be applied? Yeah, I think if you manage to develop all those questions, you have a pretty strong model that will also answer you how you actually want to handle this prop case. But let's focus on what both sides are arguing for essentially and what you want to prove on both sides. Obviously, this is a bit different than your burden of proof that you're going to have during your debate. You can take that and kind of model it into whatever you want, as long as it goes in a similar direction. But prop should, on the general, explain why those bans are going to be helpful, why currently those recordings produced by terrorists are harmful to the stakeholders, or harmful that they're being seen right now. While Op should argue that banning those recordings, just those recordings, is something that won't be as impactful. As I said, the news media and stuff can still portray and still give coverage of terroristic attacks happening. So it can be presented just as a low impact side. Or how it will negatively impact non-terrorists that might be considered as such during conflicts. And here are some potential impacts and some guide on how to weigh them. Potential impacts on prop would be that you're taking the power from some dangerous organizations that hurt people, making sure that their leaders or their appointed members to produce and be the face of those recordings. By banning them, you take that power away from them of self of deciding on their own how to present themselves in the public. Now you only have the independent news media, that the independent media that is showing this act being happening and being presented as definitely something really bad, and that way you can have people be confused and actually lead to believe those terrorists when they're producing stuff on their own. And also think about the public safety as impact, as I said, mental health or just overall safety. This can also be opposition, an opposition impact. Might be also argued that people will be less safe when they're less aware of what's happening in the world, when those recordings are being banned. On the upside, think about the efficacy of how the system, how the ban would work, how it might be ineffective, and how it can, as I said, also lead to maybe wrongful accusations. And also think about the general public's right to be fully informed. As I said, like, would they be less safe when they do not have access to view those recordings and they don't know what's happening? Finally, a very important thing. If you take only one thing about this motion, if you learn only one thing, it would be how to debate current events. You don't. And this is why we should not do it. Current events are still unresolved. We can't really evaluate it. We can't see what are the impacts of it. And also, we have emotions, sometimes lack of information, lack of knowledge of what will actually happen in the future. And all of those things prevent us from being able to look at the bigger picture. When we look at historical events, we can say what's right and what's wrong because a lot of time has already passed, and you can give your judgment on it and you can study it. Well, current events, I will advise you not to debate about. It can also lead to some sensitivity issues. So, yeah, if you're going to be using any research and historical evidence, make sure that it's that historical evidence. All right, that was a lot of information that I just spewed at you. Any questions? They might not be related to exactly what I said, just some questions that you've had regarding the motion when reading it first time, like a few weeks ago. Yes, go.
When we provide our model and when we consider the body that will be monitoring the content that is being put on different types of media, should we consider that body and what that body is and how the procedure is done to monitor and kind of um, evaluate which information should be put on the news and which should not be.
Sorry, can you repeat your question? Because that was a very long question and had like a
Yeah,
few.
it was a nice question, but uh, should we provide the body that monitors the information that is put on the news or in any other sort of media?
Yeah, you should definitely consider that. For example, if you choose like the government is going to be the one to monitor it, obviously it can't be like the president monitoring the media. You have to think about who is the government going to hire. Is there going to be a special branch of the government, special association of people that are like that have experience not only with politics but also with media and with media presence to make sure that those things are banned and make sure that they monitor the media is doing their job and not presenting such content.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you as well. Um, do we have other questions? All right. Yeah. Yeah, Lilia.
Uh, since this house wood motion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, this suggests that the prop cannot control the outcome or reaction of the motion. So, how do we really look? How do we read the motion without going into a what if type of situation?
Okay, so a this house with motion means that the proposition is actually the one that feel like action needs to be taken. So they have to explain how would that action work. That's why we have the model. That's why we explain how things are gonna happen. And in order to avoid as much as what if situations as you could, it would be best to research as much as possible on previous such bans, if there were any, or previous historical events that might have needed to have those bans, and the negative effects of not having such bans instituted. And when you have that information, you can make an educated guess that's not going to be leading to a what if, because now you know the facts, now you know the situation. You're like, we need to impose this ban because bad things have happened without this ban, and now we need to have it in order to mitigate, in order to prevent such bad impacts.
All right.
Okay. Uh, all right. Any other questions regarding this motion? Okay, I'm gonna move on then to the next motion. This house prefers a world where instead of charging tuition fees to students upfront, universities collect a portion of their income upon graduation. Important terms. Here we have a motion that this house prefers a world. In a this house prefers a world, in contrast to the this house would motion, you don't really have to explain how that would happen, because it's more of a hypothetical. It's we prefer if the current world was made as what we're saying the motion to be. It's not the world is gonna change from our current status quo to what we are proposing. It's we wish that the current world was already what we are trying to propose. Um, so usually those motions are about are more focused in um, morals and practicality, but more on the prose side of things, especially for reply speeches. Uh, don't start a reply speech with imagine a world. We've already covered that in reply speeches workshops. But try to really paint us a picture, especially in the reply, but in your whole case, what this proposed world is going to be and why is it better on all sides than the current status quo. And the proposition has a hard job here because they have to prove that not only that it's going to be not worse, but they only have to prove that it's more than equal. They have to prove that this world would definitely be better. Well, the opposition can be like, it's gonna be kind of the same. Um, and that way they kind of have to um, prove it's equal or worse, the opposition, where the proposition definitely has to prove that this world would be better than the current one we live in. We also have the terms upfront and upon graduation. Um, this is the major shift that we have between both worlds. How is it gonna change when those tuition fees are collected before? And by before we can count it as paying all at once, and then having like a 3-year or 4-year bachelor or whatever, or semester by semester basis. Well, upon graduation would mean after you graduate and after you find a job, they start getting a percentage of your income. This leads us to believe, though, that universities are going to be maybe doing trying to do more in order to ensure that their university graduates are actually finding their jobs, so they can, be able to actually pay them in the end. Key actors, I think the main stakeholders of this debate are the university students, especially when the motion is so focused on tuition fees and the way they're going to be taken from them. You have to focus on what's most beneficial for the students. And you also have, as a secondary thing to consider, how are those universities going to work when they do not get those fees and tuitions up front and after graduation? Would they be struggling more financially? Would they be better? Because if they are struggling financially, it might lead to an argument, financial arguments about how that would impact the facilities of a university, their actual if they're promising to find you a job and teach you well, how are they going to do it if they're not as financially capable as they could be? And we are talking mostly about private universities because most public universities are either free or their tuition fees are so low that a system like that would be very low impact. Whether you pay the 300 leva before your semester or when you graduate, does not really make that much of a difference. As I kind of touched upon, Prop is going to be arguing that their side is offering a better alternative to higher education, a better alternative to the way higher education is being paid for, and it's definitely a better one, not equal, not worse, it's better. And OP is going to be arguing that our current status quo, our current world is the better alternative or is the same. Potential impacts from the prop, we have job market stability. As I said, think about and kind of develop the argument how it's going to happen when those universities are collecting a portion of their income upon graduation. This would mean that you need to have a job in order to pay the uni. The university is obviously going to want to have money, so they're going to want to have their students to actually get a job and get a job in the field that they've been studying in. And also consider how, as an impact, education will be better or whether it would be worse if you're on site opposition. On opposition, we already talked about the university funding, and overall just logistics and taking advantage of the system, such as what happens if you drop out, if you study for 2 years and then you drop out, do you pay anything at all? Do you have those 2 years just for free, taking advantage of the professors of the universities, the facilities, the materials that you get as a student, just because you've dropped out and now they can't really gather any fees from you. And there are a lot of other logistics that you need to clear out as proposition, and opposition can be like, hey, you didn't really explain how that's going to work and why that's going to be better. And you can kind of, it's your moment to shine and be like, this is why this world is just not feasible to live in. That was from the universities. Do you have any questions? Yes, Nicoleta.
What if they just want to, let's say, would it be a good thing to basically counter the argument of, well, job stability, sure, but what if people want to basically try out the field and get to know it? Would it be a good rebuttal to job stability?
in what way trying the job field? Trying the job field by studying the bachelor at university, or just trying like a year or two of working after graduating?
I was talking about like after graduation. So like if the university wants to offer a job to the students so they can take up fees, um, they would ensure the job. But if the student wants to try out different jobs so they can be sure what they want, they don't want to stick to one specific job, would that be possible with such a system? And would that be great rebuttal to such arguments?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd say that this debate obviously does not need a model. It would need great framing from both sides in order to explain why the education system exists like that, like currently. What are the current problems of the education system, and what the what prop is actually trying to solve. So if we look at universities as something that we go in order to be made sure that we can take a certain job, which needs a certain qualification that we cannot get anywhere else otherwise, then we can have prop essentially be like, this is gonna change the system in a way, because now students are gonna be sure that they're going in those bachelors, in those degrees. Sorry, OP is gonna OP might argue that it's not really, you're not really committing if you're not paying those fees, and therefore it's not going to be that sure that you're going to be finding a job. Therefore, as I said, prop is going to be arguing that universities are going to be trying to actually get you a job easier and faster so they can get those money. It's about weighing those impacts and rebuttals. So I'd say it definitely could be a more thought out and better rebuttal, what you're trying to present.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, the motion is rather new. It was okay. Now we have another person joining in. I thought it was someone raising their hand. It's a new motion, so if you have any questions about it later on, you can message Best Foundation on Instagram or Facebook, or just email us with any questions you have, and they will be answered. It's obviously better if they're answered now, because this seminar is going to be uploaded in a few days, maybe a week, so everybody who watches it can also hear the answers to the questions. And yeah. But, yep. Yanni?
To a model in the prefers motion, right?
Sorry?
Do we have the right to a model in this type of perverse motion?
Yes.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be a wood motion in order to have a model. Thank you, Yanni, because it's great to also answer it to other people. Models, technically, you can include in every debate if you think they're gonna help you. The only problem with adding motion is first they're gonna be taking from your valuable time to present arguments, burdens, framing, and on the other side, the opposition can use those models to their advantage. And if a model is not really well thought out, it's gonna only work against you. So if you want to include a model, like I'm saying this to all participants right now, if you want to include a model, do it, but make sure it's really solid and really thought out, and that you can also present it in like under a minute for sure. So yeah. And if there aren't any questions, I'm gonna let Ari present to you the next two motions. about space exploration and voting.
Hello. I'm so excited to be here with all of you. I'm not sure that we've all met, so I'll take 30 seconds to introduce myself. Hello. My name is Ariana Wheeler. Everybody calls me Ari, and I'm a first-year ETA in Dobrich, and I'm the new debate program assistant. So you will see me around, and I look forward to getting to know all of you in the course of the next year. So let me just go ahead and share my screen, and we can start talking about some of the other motions. All right. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to be covering two motions. The first of which is going to be for Fall East, and it is that this House would make voting compulsory. And the second is for Fall West, that this House would abandon all space exploration. So the first motion regarding compulsory voting, consider the key actors and definitions and kind of thinking about who is important in this debate. The first group I think that is important to consider here are registered voters, right? Because those are the people that are going to be impacted by this motion. Those are the people that are going to have to change activity if they don't vote, under the status quo. So I think it's important to consider, who voters are, why they should be voting, why they shouldn't have to vote. So that's going to be a very key group here, of course. Next is political candidates, right? Because when voting is a requirement and candidates no longer need to appeal to people to vote, it changes the way that they, appeal for different policies, the way they talk to voters, the way they run for office. It can change incentives to vote. It can, alter how they choose to run for office. So I think this is another key group of stakeholders when you consider this motion. Third, government officials. So I think that it's also important to consider how this motion and how this policy might impact the government itself and how government officials function. If they know that there is going to be guaranteed high voter turnout, that might change the kind of policies that they implement. It might change, levels of corruption. I think it's important to think about how it's going to impact the existing political system, those that are in office currently, in addition to the people that are going to run for office. All right. And lastly, society in general. I think this is an important thing to consider, specifically when we're thinking about democracies in general. I think there's a lot of room for philosophical thinking in this round, because you're kind of considering, what it means to be a democracy, what democracy actually, entails. I think that there's room for a principles discussion here. And I think it's also important to consider what civil liberties are, what freedom of speech means, if freedom of speech will actually apply or continue to apply if people are forced or required to vote. All right, so who is this House? Again, because this is a wood debate, you are going to be creating a model, but I think the important group to consider here are democratic governments. I think that kind of, takes away a lot of extra noise. But I think it's just important to consider that democratic governments are going to be implementing this policy. So that's likely going to be the actor for this House. So what terms will possibly lead to confusion in the round? So I think that compulsory might not be something that you think about very often, but all it is, or all it means, is that something will be required by law or obligatory. Okay. So what is your advocacy? So what is each side actually arguing for? Prop should prove that mandatory and compulsory voting has benefits that outweigh any cons that might exist, right? And again, there might be some more, moral principles that apply here, or that might be something that you guys get into in this debate. And if that's something that you're considering, you have to prove that the moral imperative on prop is greater than, what might exist on the opposition side. And then op must prove that the harms of this policy would outweigh any potential benefits. Right. What could your model look like? So I think that to kind of approach this, it would be wise to look into countries with existing compulsory voting laws. So as of right now, there are 21 countries that have implemented this policy over the years, 11 of which are in Latin America. I think looking and seeing, historically what this has looked like will be very helpful when you approach either argument. So I think when you're thinking about a model, it's going to be important to know what this policy looks like in action. And I think the key here is determining what the penalty is going to be for opting to not vote in democratic elections or for not voting at all. Again, I don't think it's a very common or popular thing to instill like some sort of criminal, sentence for not voting in these states. But I think a fine is something that's looking at, what your model could look like. Again, just kind of thinking about what it looks like in the real world, and then thinking about what a penalty might look like for not voting. Again, I think a fine is something that is a very common thing, or a tax on people that opt not to vote as a form of penalty. So I think that's something you consider when you're thinking about what your model might look like. Next, what are the potential impacts, right? And how do we weigh them? So something to consider here is that this motion coming into play would guarantee a higher voter turnout, right? So it might have stronger implications for democracy. If democracy in an existing country is not incredibly strong because of voter turnout, this policy might allow for greater representation, for more voices, for policies that better reflect what people actually want. So that's something to consider. And honestly, that's something to consider is if that's a good thing. There are arguments that say that if 100% of the population votes, then, there might be tyranny of the majority. Thinking about those philosophical, approaches to this argument is going to be huge. And I think weighing whether or not, those larger philosophical implications, moral implications, outweigh the practical necessity of people voting in a democracy in order to pass meaningful policy. Something else to consider is how it's going to impact candidates and their behavior in the election season. It might mean that candidates have to actually appeal to a large portion of the population, that they actually have to, promise policies that are going to impact and help the most people. But it also might lead to more, nefarious, bad behavior on behalf of candidates. They might, use other, strategies to, get votes, to buy votes. So I think that's an important thing to consider here as well. Thinking about legitimacy, if a democratic government exists, or even like a newer democratic government exists, having high voter turnout might enhance the, strength of the existing government, the legitimacy of an existing government. But it could also threaten existing legitimacy for certain governments. So I think that there are two sides to that are important to evaluate here. Something to think about, again, in terms of principle, is like this idea of compelled speech. If that's a violation of this idea of freedom of speech, of freedom of choice, if that choice is important, if autonomy for people is important, and if compelled speech is free speech at all, if people are being forced to vote, does that kind of violate this whole idea of democracy and allowing people to decide and contribute to government freely? So again, another question to consider here, something like religious objections. If we're violating people's religious freedom if they opt not to vote for those reasons. I think that's an important thing to consider here as well. And this is obviously dependent on the model. But if, the impacts here or if the penalty is going to be a tax, is that something that is going to hit harder for individuals with a lower socioeconomic status or poor individuals and kind of forcing them to vote? How that might interact with, how candidates choose to target their policy or their campaigns. So I think all of these impacts exist, and kind of you just have to choose which ones you want to focus on based on whether or not you're taking a more practical approach to this argument, more philosophical approach, or both. But I think these are all important here. So again, kind of thinking about what impacts matter the most in this round, I think that the interaction between them is going to be something crucial to consider here. So I know I just talked a lot at you and we had some technical difficulties, but does anyone have any questions about this motion? No? Okay. All right, well, if that changes, you know where we are, but in the interest of time, oh, yes. Hi, Nicoletta. Yes.
If that said, like, I haven't looked at the countries yet because I haven't, but the countries which are modeled as countries with compulsory voting, have they had like positive totally forgot the word just now, but
No, that's okay. Like positive results.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that's the interesting thing is I think that the results of this kind of vary based on the country. So I think it's important to look at a few options. It's important to kind of evaluate all of them. And then again, if there's any current debate over compulsory voting, like I know there's one country, I forget which one it is, honestly. I have like a list. And I know one, it's a very recent policy implementation. I wouldn't, base any arguments on that because it is so recent. But there are countries that have had this in place since like the 1980s. So I would just look at, like what that country looks like, how stable it is. Maybe look at the voter turnout rates in that country. I think the most important thing isn't necessarily the results, even though I just talked about that, but I think it's looking at what that policy actually looks like when it's in action. And I think that's going to be important for modeling purposes, to figure out what countries do to incentivize people to vote, like what actually happens, and then kind of going from there in terms of how you choose to model this round. Does that make sense? I hope that answers.
Yeah, totally. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Anything else? No. Okay, well, again, if that changes, let us know. I'm excited about this round, guys. I think it's going to be an interesting debate to see. Okay. Yes, Nicoletta, I'm sorry.
I just remembered. Do you have anything specific about the behavior of political candidates, like something that would effectively change in their behavior?
So an example might be vote buying. Like if everybody's guaranteed to vote, right? Like if everybody has to vote, then it might mean that there are in certain circumstances like bribery that takes place to incentivize people to vote for them, right? It could also just mean that, again, a lot when you think about political campaigns, a lot of it is just incentivizing people to go out to vote, right? And if they associate if a person associates voting with a particular candidate, then that gets you on their side, right? But if that is completely eliminated, then it might mean that they actually have to consider what policies are going to be the most impactful. So I think it can have positive impacts on candidate behavior, and I think it can have negative impacts on candidate behavior. So I think that's just something to consider here, and like how campaigns for office are going to look different in this world, because you also have to reach out to far more people, not just a few key demographics, because that everybody is going to be voting. Any other questions? Yeah, Maria.
Yeah, thank you. You talked a little bit about tyranny of the majority, and I was thinking about how that could impact the candidate's behavior. And don't you think that maybe there's a chance of candidates having very, very similar policies in order to attract the majority of the population? Because currently, the lower socioeconomic parts of the society and also the middle class, they don't vote as much as they would in this assumption scenario. And don't you think that the candidates' policies will become very similar in order to attract this bigger percentage, or is that a little bit far-fetched?
I don't think that that's far-fetched. I think there's definitely an argument to be made about how policy is going to become less like polarized because there are going to be so many people that are going to need to be considered because again, the turnout is going to be huge. So I think there are arguments that can be made about that. Again, I think research about like how this has impacted what policy looks like in those countries would be huge. I think that would be super helpful. Just to kind of get an idea about how, you know, close these political platforms might look in this context. All right. So I wish I had a like more, you know, concrete answer for you, but I think that that's what good research can do to answer that for you.
Thank you.
Of course. Anything else? Want to talk about outer space? No? Okay. All right. Well, again, if that changes, you know where we are. Let's keep on going. Okay. So let's talk about space exploration. So this motion, again, is for Fall West, and it's that this House would abandon all space exploration. So again, what are the key actors? Who is important here? I think first we can think about scientists, we can think about astronauts, because these are the two major groups that are involved in the act of exploring space. I think it's going to be important to consider these people and the nature of their work, how long they've been working at this, what that field looks like, how expansive it is, like how many people are involved, like what people study this in school, like this is like an entire academic and professional field. So if we were just to say, you know what, we're done, how is that going to impact these two major groups? But next, I think governments is going to be important because a lot of space exploration is funded by massive, massive federal subsidies. It's not private or commercial. So I think it's going to be important to consider the impacts that might have on governments and their decision to shift policy focuses away from space exploration. This was a huge topic in like the Cold War, right? Like the space race was like this huge deal. And politically, like who was able to get into space first was important. And that still remained true up to a point. So I think it's important to consider, the role that governments play here, and the impacts that abandoning space exploration might have on government goals and, even international relations within that context. Humanity, I know, very broad, but I think it's also, we've kind of developed this, shared idea that exploring space is, crucial for our survival as the human race, right? Like eventually Earth isn't going to be here anymore, and what are we going to do? So I think considering the implications for our future as a population and what that means for humanity is something, as broad as it is something that you're going to want to consider within this debate. Who is this House? So like I said, because governments are the ones mostly funding these efforts, I think governments with active interest in space exploration are going to be, who approaches this issue. I wouldn't spend too much time thinking, too deeply about like that part, but I think it's important to consider the fact that, individual governments have an impact on, space exploration and its ability to continue. What terms would possibly lead to confusion in this round? Abandon, I thought might be, kind of tough to navigate. This doesn't necessarily undo everything that's been done. It doesn't mean that we're going to, just be like, oh, space doesn't exist. We don't know what planets there are. But it would prevent further investment in activity. But again, I think their burden is going to be to model what abandoning exploration would look like for the future. All right. So what is your advocacy? So prop must prove that the harms of space exploration outweigh the benefits, whereas op has to prove the opposite to be true. I think that's pretty, clear. Let's think about impacts. So first, again, nice and light, the fate of the human race on Earth. Again, I think that this is something that we've equated space with, like space is going to be our savior at some point. Eventually, there's going to be a group of people that move to Mars because, Earth isn't going to be enough for us anymore. So I think it's important to consider, how we equate, our future with space exploration. So something to consider here. The existence of extraterrestrial life, like we've all constantly wondered, like, do aliens exist? Are they good? Are they bad? Will they be important for us as humans? And if we abandon space exploration, we're not really going to find out much more about it, right? So again, how much do we care about extraterrestrial life? The inevitable shift towards domestic policy investment. If we retract all of the money that we are putting into space exploration, eventually, of course, that might mean greater investment in domestic policy, social policy, healthcare policy. Like, I think considering what that money is going to go towards is going to be an impact that you guys can use in this debate. Medical developments. So there has been discussion over whether or not medical advancement and, cures for certain diseases, or even I think there's even been some discussion of cancer cures being found in space. But also, how healthy it is to be in space for human beings if the inevitable goal of space exploration is to send people there, en masse. Like, I think that it's important to consider the biological, implications for people and how it might impact them. So again, medical developments might be huge. And again, the socioeconomic divide of space exploration, like when you're poor, it's very difficult to make space exploration a priority, right? But then you see like Jeff Bezos, like just getting a rocket and sending himself and a few other people to space. So I think that that's something to consider here, as well as like how accessible space exploration, or even the idea of it, is. And if we are to continue doing it, how we might bridge that socioeconomic divide, if we can, if that matters. Again, that's something to consider on both sides here. And again, what sort of impacts matter the most? Again, I think that there's an additional like philosophical versus practical idea here. And I think considering both is going to be really important for a good debate here, and how they interact with each other. Like the fate of the human race on Earth, like how does that equate to like considering extraterrestrial life, or maybe the domestic policy of certain countries that are spending a lot of money on space exploration matters more for our fate as a human race, right? So again, I think considering how those interact is going to be